Hello friends. In the last two lectures, we discussed the career and policies of the first Tudor monarch, that is Henry VII. I wonder how you have been following these lectures. It may be a good idea to sit with a paper and pencil and take down the bare essentials, for instance the names, which are likely to be forgotten. And then, after you have heard the lecture, it would be a good idea to write down a brief note regarding the facts that you came to know from the lecture. This would help you remember things. British history may not appear to you as immediately relevant to your study of British poetry. However, the policy on which we have framed the course is that of discovering the man, the milieu, and the moment. A work of art is not entirely a product of the historical background of the age. It is a product of the personality of the poet, or the artist for that matter. And every individual is a product of his or her time. So, the better you understand the historical background, the cultural background of the age, the more you will be able to appreciate literature in its proper context. But I would repeat once again that literature is not entirely a product of the age in which it was written. The personality of the poet, the artist, mattered. The immediate experience that brought about the work of art was no less important. And you, as student of literature, must have a balanced understanding of all these various forces that went into the making of a piece of literature. That is the reason in every block you have a unit on the background of the age, another unit on the life and work of the poet, and then you have a discussion on the poetry, the prescribed poems, which are also there in the blocks. Today we are going to talk about the son and successor of Henry VII, that is Henry VIII, who ascended the throne in 1599 at the age of 18 and went on to rule over England for 38 years. You would remember that Henry VIII had been married off to the wife of Arthur, the elder brother. Excuse me. That is Catherine of Aragon. But for many years after marriage, Henry found that most of his children, 5 of them, died at a very young age. 1 week girl child, Mary, survived. And Henry VIII wanted a male heir to the throne. He was a bit superstitious. He thought, excuse me, he thought that because he had married the wife of his elder brother, so he had committed some kind of adultery, and the death of his children was the result of God's anger. You would remember that Henry VIII was a devout Christian, a devout Catholic. He had written against Luther and in favor of the king. Luther, you would remember, was a great Protestant leader in Germany. And so Henry decided to get rid of his wife, that is Catherine of Aragon, by a divorce, rather by having the marriage recognized as non-existent, not having taken place. Now for this, the permission had to be gained from the Pope. Excuse me. If you ever visit Madame Tussauds in London, you would see the hefty, handsome figure of Henry VIII standing between two rows of his wives. He had 6 of them, one after another, of course. And that is one fact that is remembered by many people. Historians remember Henry VIII's reign also for the Chancellor, that was Wolsey, Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was son of a merchant, an Ipswich merchant, and his father sent him to Oxford, to Magdalen College, Oxford, where he got his BA at the age of 14, and then he became a fellow and a tutor at that college, where he was discovered by a certain marquess whose children he had taught, and she introduced him to Henry VII. As he was a man of great capability. In 1514, he was made Bishop of York. Soon, he was made Chancellor. Henry used his position to have him declared a cardinal. Cardinal is a very important position in the Church of Europe. There are only 60 cardinals in the Pope's cabinet, as it were. And he was one of them. Wolsey was one of them. Later, Henry used his influence to have him made the episcopal legate. Legate is a slightly old word which means an ambassador. it would still be better to say that he was a plenipotentiary. That is, he could act on behalf of the Pope in England. So Wolsey became a very powerful person in England. So Henry's reign is remembered and will be remembered also excuse me, for Wolsey's policies and career. About Wolsey, a Venetian ambassador had written, and I would read it out for you. Very handsome, eloquent, and of vast ability. Very handsome, eloquent, and of vast ability. He alone does business which occupies many offices at Venice, and all state affairs are managed by him. He is the person who rules both the king and the kingdom. He is the person who rules both the king and the kingdom. Such was Henry's influence. Wolsey was now asked to intervene on behalf of Henry VIII, to persuade the Pope to have the marriage with Catherine of Aragon declared null and void. Pope Clement at this time was a prisoner of the Spanish royal family of Maximilian, and Catherine of Aragon came from that Spanish family. So although Clement wanted to win the favors of Henry and the French king also, in order to contain the influence of the Spanish royal family, the Habsburg family, so he delayed for a long time, much to the anger of Henry VIII, and later sent a Cardinal Compaggio to England to decide the case on its merit with the help of Cardinal Wolsey. Catherine of Aragon was rigid, and she wanted the case to be tried in Rome rather than London, because she knew that the judgment would not go in her favor if it was tried in London. So the matter went back to the Pope in 1529, and the Pope refused to declare the marriage with Catherine of Aragon as null and void. This was a landmark in the history of England. But before we go any further, let us go back in time to the early days of Henry VIII. The first few years, 4 or 5 years of Henry VIII. Henry VIII followed his father's principle of making himself strong at home making himself popular with the common people and pursuing a strong policy on the continent which would increase the influence of the prestige of England on the continent. So, Henry first had the Earl of Suffolk. You remember he was nephew of Edward VI, who had been surrendered by Philip of Burgundy to Henry VII on the understanding, on the assurance that his life would be protected. Henry VII kept his word, but he wanted his son to get him beheaded so that no future threat could be there to his throne. You would also remember that there were two famous lawyers, or rather infamous lawyers, in the court of Star Chamber. One of them was called Dudley and the other Empson. They were very unpopular with the people at large. And Henry VIII was so unscrupulous as to get them executed on a charge of high treason. Dudley and Empson had been loyal servants to the throne, but they were now no longer required. And Henry, in order to win popularity for himself, had both Dudley and Empson executed. In 1513, Henry invaded France. At the behest of the Spanish king, Charles V. Because on the continent, the two powers, France and Spain, had been in constant struggle, and both needed the support of the English monarch. Excuse me. Henry, in order to please Spain, Catherine of Aragon belonged to that royal family, his wife. So in order to please Spain, he attacked France and besieged Therouanne at the Battle of Gingaste. At the Battle of Gingaste, the French called it the Battle of Spurs because they thought that no swords were wielded at Gingaste. The French used only their spurs, and so Therouanne was lost. The French had always been a close ally of the Scottish people. So now, James IV of Scotland attacked England. You would remember that James IV was husband of Margaret, his sister. And overlooking or ignoring this relationship, he attacked England. Earl of Surrey the famous poet, the famous Elizabethan poet, about whom you would read in your course material. He led an army against the Scots, and because of his good strategy, he succeeded in decimating the Scottish army, and James IV died on the field. Then he discovered that the Spaniards had become too powerful, and they attacked France. Henry now took care to win over the French, because Wolsey's policy was to maintain a balance of power on the continent. This policy has proved to be very long lasting. So, Henry gave away his youngest sister Mary in marriage to Louis XII, the French monarch. And this was in 1514, just a year after the Battle of Gingaste, or Battle of Spurs. Excuse me. However, 3 months after the marriage, Louis XII died, and Francis I became King of France. Mary was now given away in marriage to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and she thus became the ancestress of Lady Jane Grey, who you would meet later in the history of the Tudor era. Now, I have already told you about Thomas Wolsey, and he was now under pressure to get the permission of the Pope or have the marriage declared null and void. But in the meantime, in 1599, Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, died. Voltaire wrote that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor was it Roman, nor was it an empire, because the Holy Roman Emperor had never been a Roman. It was not a monarchy in which the Pope had any say. The Pope was rather a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor. And then it was not an empire, because it was a loose confederation of many German states, Austria being the largest of them. So Maximilian died in 1519. An election had to take place, and there were only 7 voters. The voters were Archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, Trier, and electors of Bohemia, Saxony, Brandenburg, and the Palatinate. It is not necessary to remember all these names. It is just to have an idea of what was happening in Europe about this time, and how the European powers collided with one another. Excuse me. On this occasion. And who were the candidates for election? The candidates were Charles V of Spain, Francis I of France, and of course Henry VIII of England. And Charles V of Spain got elected Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a large empire which included Spain, Holland, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and Naples. And the Holy Roman Empire had a tough time fighting excuse me, various forces which included the Turks in the east. Now, Francis began to woo Henry, and Henry was only too willing to be won over by Francis. So he went to Calais in France on the French king's invitation. The French king treated him royally with great splendor, and so the event is called Field of the Cloth of Gold. Field of the Cloth of Gold. However, now Charles went to England and tried to win over Henry. And then Henry got swayed, and in 1525 Spain attacked France, and at the Battle of Pavia Francis was taken prisoner. So the French monarch became a prisoner of the Spanish king. Spain was now a very powerful empire. And this Henry did not like. Now, Wolsey began to plan a marriage alliance of Henry with a French princess, because he thought that that would cement the relationship between France and England. Wolsey wrote, "If I could see the king well married and the church reformed, I could die happy. If I could see the king well married and the church reformed, I could die happy." Now was the time coming for Henry to get disenchanted with Catherine of Aragon, for reasons I have already told you. And then Henry wanted Wolsey to get his marriage with Catherine declared null and void, and his eyes were on a beautiful lady in the court called Anne Boleyn. In 1529, as I have already told you, that Henry's petition to the Pope, as it were, failed, and Henry decided to invoke the old law of Act of Praemunire. Act of Praemunire. This was an old law. According to this law, no one was allowed to make an appeal either to Rome or to accept any letters or instructions from the Pope. By the Act of Praemunire, I may repeat, no one was allowed to either write or approach the Pope or receive any letters from Rome. Henry had so far not invited, not called the Parliament like his father, and he wanted to rule without the Parliament. You remember how Henry VII taxed the people indirectly through what is known as Morton's fork, for instance. Henry now decided to call the Parliament because the religious places, the religious houses, the monasteries had not been popular with the people. They taxed the people. They had set heavy charges for the religious rites that they performed. And these things made the monasteries very unpopular with the common people. The Parliament, the English Parliament, had always wanted to get rid of these monasteries, to confiscate their land and properties and distribute them among themselves. So in 1529, what is known as the Reformation Parliament, which sat now no longer for a few weeks to a few months, but for 7 years, which completed the task of what is known as political reformation in England. The Church of England had been part of Rome, the Catholic Church, since the Synod of Whitby. A synod is a council, an assembly of church people, of ecclesiastics, and also influential laity. And the clergy paid what are known as tenths, I'll repeat, tenths, and first fruits. So a tenth part of the income of a diocese, of a religious house or religious congregation, had to go to Rome. And the first fruits is whatever income a religious house derived in the first year of its existence also had to be given away to the Pope. So the church paid, the clergy paid tenths and first fruits. And the common people paid what is known as Peter's pence. Peter's pence. Peter, you would remember, was one of the apostles of Jesus Christ. He was responsible for founding the church in Rome. And Peter is believed to hold the key to heaven. Peter is generally seen with a bunch of keys because he is supposed to hold the key to heaven. So every family which had land and property was supposed to pay a pence, certain amount of money, to Rome every year. Now, Henry forbade the payment of any of these amounts to Rome. Wolsey himself supported the Reformation of the Church on the continent, and he wanted, as the Pope, to undertake that Reformation, because the Church had been very unpopular. They were idle, there was corruption among the clergy, and the common people did not like the clergymen. In the time of Wycliffe, you would remember, was a contemporary of Chaucer. He lived from 1320 to 1384. Chaucer, you would remember, lived from 1340 to 1400. So John Wycliffe had written against the corruption in the church, and the church had not improved in these 200 years. So Henry got himself declared supreme head of the church and clergy. He wanted the people to accept him, the clergy to accept him as such, and they did so. Now, the bishops were to be appointed by the monarch rather than the Pope. Earlier, the Pope used to appoint the bishops in the bishoprics in England. So, a new method was devised. Henry would send, and this has been the practice ever since, a letter called Cong de Lire, by which the dean and chapter of a particular diocese where a vacancy had been created by death or otherwise was asked to appoint or elect a bishop. This letter was soon followed by a letter missive from the throne, in which a suggestion was given as to who was to be elected. And it is a fact of British history that never ever a diocese has gone against the order of the throne. In 1535, the Parliament declared Henry, that is the English monarch, supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This was by what is known as Act of Supremacy. And Henry became the head of the church. In 1529, as he became suspicious of Thomas Wolsey, he discharged him, and he appointed Sir Thomas More. You would be familiar with this name, as he was the author of Utopia, or Nowhere. Utopia purports to be an imaginary place which is well governed, where there is communism, where women are taken care of. In fact, it is a satire on the English society. So, Henry appointed Sir Thomas More as his Chancellor. But Thomas More was unwilling to have the marriage with Catherine of Aragon annulled, because that was against the wishes of the Church, against the wishes of the Pope. And Henry, as he had got Wolsey, he wanted to have Wolsey beheaded, but he died on his way from excuse me, on his way from York to London, where he would have been beheaded, but he died on way to London. Wolsey had, Henry had Sir Thomas More beheaded, along with Fisher, who was a Bishop of Rochester. He too had opposed the king. And there is a lady about whom we don't know very much. She was a nun of Kent. She too was beheaded because she was unwilling to belong to a church that was not governed by the chief agent of God on earth that the Pope was seen as. All this would create the impression that the Reformation that Henry was bringing in the Church of England was a very sincere attempt to reform it. In my next lecture, I will tell you how Henry's Reformation was only a royal reformation, a political reformation, and not a religious reformation. Thomas Cranmer, the Cambridge scholar, who brought about this religious reformation in the reign of Edward VI, was an advance towards reformation in England. Thank you.